Are you ready to peer behind the curtain of time? That curtain which conceals the most intimate, the most clandestine aspects of human history? Brace yourselves, because today we embark on a breathtaking journey across the boundless ocean of human experience. An ocean where waves of passion, desire, and intimacy don't just crash against the shores of millennia, but actually shape entire civilizations. Its name? Sex. This isn't merely a universal, profound experience. It's a powerful, almost magical force that has always captivated attention, yet, surprisingly, evoked the most polarized reactions. From sacred rituals imbued with a mystical golden aura, to the strictest taboos that reduced desires to whispers behind tightly closed wooden doors. From the open, audacious celebration of carnal pleasures to scorching shame. Humanity has truly traversed an incredible path in understanding its own sexuality. But how exactly did these intimate relationships form and transform? Across cultures stretching from the scorching golden sands of ancient Egypt to the frozen, snow-covered expanses of ancient Rus, and most importantly, what can we, people of the 21st century, truly learn about ourselves by delving into this age-old, intricate, yet endlessly fascinating and provocative history? Prepare yourselves, for the answers may shock you. So, buckle up. Our journey takes a sharp turn, heading straight into the heart of the mighty Roman Empire. But my friends, let me warn you up front. Exploring the sexual customs of ancient Rome isn't about the frivolous stereotypes like shiny but empty masks shaped by mass culture. No. This is a deep dive into a detailed, meticulous analysis of authentic historical sources, much like archaeologists brushing dust off ancient scrolls. The modern perception of the Eternal City as a hub of excessive moral freedom? It's true, but incredibly oversimplified at the same time. A far more nuanced, profound approach is needed here. Are you ready for Rome to completely redefine your understanding of morality? Ancient Roman society operated with its own codes, utterly unique, as if carved from a special marble. Both moral and legal, and they differed radically from ours. Imagine a world where some forms of behavior that today we would unequivocally deem criminal or immoral, in Rome could be legal, or at the very least, tolerated. Same-sex relationships, prostitution, pimping, even the distribution of explicit images, none of this was ever legally prohibited in the Roman Empire. Yes, restrictions existed, but here's the twist that will make you ponder. Their application was strikingly selective, often dependent on a person's social status and the context of the situation. Could status truly outweigh any law? And here's another astonishing fact that will, without a doubt, shock modern sensibilities: the concept of domestic violence. In our current ethical legal understanding, it was practically non-existent, as if it didn't even exist in Roman law or public consciousness. And threats of rape? You will be surprised to learn they were mentioned in Roman literature far more often than the acts themselves. This, you must agree, eloquently speaks volumes about the specifics of social control, about the rhetoric of that era, as if whispering to us from the depths of centuries. Ancient Roman society was thoroughly permeated with sexuality. It manifested literally everywhere, in art, in mythology, in daily customs, and even in the very language. Take, for example, the god Priapus. This deity of field and garden fertility, borrowed from the Greeks, was a key symbol of male potency and abundance. Images of Priapus with his enormous, perpetually erect phallus were ubiquitous. They adorned gardens, homes, and public places as if declaring, "This is natural, this is the force of life." Romans openly expressed their passion for sex, integrating this theme into their culture and worldview. And did you know that the Latin language even boasted dozens of synonyms for genitalia and various sexual acts? This further underscores their astonishingly open attitude. Wow, what a scope for self-expression. And now, let's delve into the world of the ideal Roman woman. Roman women, in turn, did not expect absolute fidelity from their husbands. This was part of the unspoken rules of marriage. Moreover, in Roman literature, there are practically no images of femme fatale stealing husbands from families. Why? This is explained quite prosaically by the availability of prostitution. Legal prostitution in Rome satisfied male sexual needs outside marriage. It reduced the need for intrigues and secret affairs. And here's an absolutely astonishing fact that will shock you. A bored or sexually unsatisfied married Roman woman could legally register as a courtesan through a city official, the aedile. This registration allowed her to satisfy her needs within the law while avoiding public censure. Sometimes women resorted to this, even with the knowledge and consent of their own husbands. This can't be, you might say. But it happened. Imagine the scale of this freedom. Marriage in ancient Rome. It was an institution, primarily for ensuring status, partnership, and the continuation of the lineage, not purely for romantic relationships. Husband and wife were like-minded individuals, comrades, and only then, if they were lucky, romantics, lovers. Most Romans, men and women alike, perfectly understood these rules of the game. They accepted the conventions of the marital union. The poet Horace, for example, advised young unmarried Romans, "Seek pleasures with prostitutes, not with girls from your own circle." Why? To avoid offending the latter and getting into trouble with their families. Horace vividly described the tragic fate of those who, due to lack of means, engaged in free sex and were caught red-handed. The unexpected return of the master of the house, the woman's husband, father, or brother, led to severe consequences for the unwelcome guest. One jumped from the roof, saving his life. Another was cruelly flogged with a whip. A third had to humiliatingly buy his way out, saving his life and honor. Wow, how sharply was the question of honor felt. Well, let's talk about same-sex relationships in ancient Rome. They were legal. On one condition, the boy had to be a slave, not the son of a free citizen. Such a practice gave rise to a special ancient Roman life hack for justification in awkward situations. Caught in a mistress's bedroom, declare, "I got lost, I was looking for a slave boy." And that was it. And here's another surprising detail that overturns modern notions: unusual sexual preferences or deviations in an important Roman. They did not derail his political career. Take the example of Julius Caesar. He was called the bald adulterer behind his back, but his reputation did not prevent him from becoming a key figure in history. Incredible. How did they manage this? Even if some important person was caught in same-sex relations, it did not affect their status or ambitions. However, remember, a free man could engage in such relationships only in the role of the active partner. The passive role, it was reserved for slaves and representatives of despised professions, musicians, actors. Romans believed that a passive lover irrevocably lost his masculinity. He could not be considered a complete man. Being caught in passivity was an indelible disgrace, a loss of respect. And in the Roman army? For such antics, there was only one punishment: a courageous death. Wow, the price of error was far too high. The satirist Juvenal wrote ironically about the chaste woman. What do you think he said about her? He claimed she would try to control her husband and his property. He supposed such ladies would gossip with important men, behave arrogantly, and sleep with actors or servants. At the same time, in his opinion, she herself would be jealous to hide her own adultery. If she belonged to the upper class, she probably wouldn't want children, and being rich, she would abuse cosmetics. Juvenal concluded, "Good women are boring, but life with such a freedom-loving woman would immediately sparkle with new colors. That's the trick." How the perception of female freedom changed, and the most famous freedom-loving woman of her time was Valeria Messalina, the third wife of the Roman Emperor Claudius. She changed lovers like gloves, like luxurious but quickly tiresome outfits. And even that wasn't enough to satisfy her passions. Messalina often went incognito to a brothel. She presented herself as an ordinary prostitute and received clients. You will be amazed at how far she went. But unfortunately for Messalina, she was not only incredibly freedom-loving, but also not very smart. She dared to organize a conspiracy against her own husband, Claudius, the very one who tolerated all her antics. Messalina planned to eliminate her husband to make one of her lovers emperor and rule the empire herself. But her clumsy plot was uncovered. She was offered to commit suicide. She refused. An imperial legate simply stabbed her with a dagger, thus ended her outrageous acts. Undoubtedly, far from all Roman women were like Messalina, and not all wealthy Romans corrupted young slaves. The playwright Terence, through his character, said, "I am human, and nothing human is alien to me." And this is the main thing that unites us across centuries. The overwhelming majority of ancient Romans were normal people, just like you and me. With all their virtues and flaws, they loved and broke hearts, betrayed and suffered, hated and forgave, passionately desired and coldly rejected. And each of them dreamed of finding happiness. Because dreaming, that's what humans do best. True, isn't it? After all, it's a universal aspiration, isn't it? So let's travel through time and space to ancient Greece. This is an abode of spiritual and carnal freedom. Their views on intimate life sometimes seem excessive, even by our progressive standards. To learn about the customs of the ancient Greeks, one must turn to their mythology, to legends that were passed down from generation to generation as moral stories. And here, many unusual discoveries await us, like hidden treasures. They will reveal a completely different system of values. You will be astonished. Prepare for a mythological shock. Imagine the origins of the world, shrouded in the mist of legends. Uranus was castrated by his son Cronus. This is a mythological prologue to incest and violence among the gods. Zeus, following in his father's footsteps, kills Cronus and marries Hera, who was his own sister. Incest at the very peak of the pantheon. Shock. Does such a thing happen? But that's not all. No less surprising are the legends about the gods' relations with animals and humans. Queen Pasiphae of Crete cheated on her husband with a bull. The result? The birth of the Minotaur, a monster with a bull's head and a human body. The irony? The bull itself felt no attraction to the queen. She tricked the unfortunate animal by climbing inside a wooden cow. The result of this unnatural love, the infamous Minotaur, locked in a labyrinth. And did you know that the king and his subjects reacted indifferently to such an act? Not a word of reproach to the promiscuous queen. Intimate relations with animals were common in mythology. They were not condemned. Similarly, Zeus, in the form of a graceful snow-white swan, entered into an intimate relationship with the Spartan queen Leda. Helen and Polydeuces were born from her. Wow, how blurred were the boundaries of what was permissible. Here's another interesting case with the famous Heracles. Myths report that his constant companion and squire was a youth named Iolaus, the lover of the Greek hero. This example indicates the acceptance of same-sex relationships among prominent figures of mythology. Another hero, Orpheus, lost his wife Eurydice. Where did he find solace? Among beautiful youths, cases of female infidelity in myths were widespread and, surprisingly, almost never condemned. Hardly any Greek queen didn't have a vast number of lovers and children born out of wedlock. Yet, all of them enjoyed honor and respect. However, incest between mother and son was strictly taboo. This was the most terrible sin. King Oedipus, unknowingly marrying his own mother, upon discovering this, subjected himself to exile and gouged out his eyes as if wishing to erase the horror from his retina. As we see, ancient Greek culture had a positive attitude towards various freedoms in personal life. But with certain boundaries, that's the trick. How were these boundaries defined? However, in real life, ancient Greece, everything was not as clear-cut as in myths. Here, strict rules existed. Same-sex relationships reached their peak. Between adult Greek men, mentors, and youths, eromenoi, known as pederasty. But these relationships very rarely crossed the line of platonic love and pedagogical mentorship. Men were strictly forbidden to engage in physical love with youths of citizen status. Plato often wrote that those who violated this law faced punishment, death, or exile from the polis like a plague victim. This cannot be. How fragile was the line between mentorship and crime? And what about among women? Same-sex relationships remain under question. But there are isolated cases sung about by the ancient Greek poetess Sappho. Sappho, who lived on the island of Lesbos, is a symbol of female homosexuality and free living. The free life of the inhabitants of Lesbos became widely known. It was associated precisely with female love. Lucian, writing in the first centuries of the Hellenistic world, even described special devices for women to make it easier for them to engage in physical love with each other. That is, these relationships, though not as popular as male ones, did not encounter any condemnation. Wow, how ancient was this aspect of human sexuality, regarding marriage, family life, and infidelity. Here, the Greeks were also very lenient, but with a pragmatic approach. A woman's calling? To bear children? If it didn't work out with the husband, other options had to be tried. Virginity before marriage? Desirable, but not a priority. Not an obligatory virtue. It is known that King Thespius, who had 50 unmarried daughters, offered them all to Heracles, so that each would bear a child. And if this story can be attributed to mythology, the story of King Ariston, who ruled in Sparta, leaves no doubt. It was known about the ruler that he was infertile, and when his third wife bore a child, the king himself doubted his paternity. But he eventually acknowledged it. However, after the father's death, doubts arose about the ruler's legitimacy. I'll let you in on a secret that will change your perception of inheritance. A bribed Pythia declared that Demaratus was not Ariston's son. Then Demaratus's mother confessed. That night, under the guise of her husband, she was visited by the ghost of a divine hero. The Spartans were appeased and allowed Demaratus to rule, demonstrating the priority of continuing the lineage over purity of blood. It must be said, in heroic times, marital infidelity, though condemned by patriarchally minded Greeks, did not inflict irreparable damage on a wife's reputation. Wow, how different from today, isn't it? In a number of Greek regions, for example, in Sparta, the wife did not belong to the husband. She was the property of society. This led to her external contacts not being condemned at all, and sometimes, on the contrary, encouraged by the husband himself. For example, if the husband wanted some outstanding man to be the father of his children, so that they too, when they grew up, would display the best qualities in themselves. Incredible, but true. How much did public interests prevail over personal ones? Now, let's transport ourselves through the veil of time and sands into the mystical world of ancient Egypt. There, civilization did not separate the concepts of love and sex. Sexual pleasure was elevated to a cult of holiness, like a precious gem. Thanks to this cult, gods dedicated to love and sex appeared. This reflected their enduring importance in the Egyptians' worldview. Just imagine how deeply sex was embedded in their daily lives. Imagine the beginning of all beginnings, shrouded in myths. Egyptians believed the god Atum, the most important of the pantheon, created the world through self-pleasure. According to myth, he ejaculated the first gods, and from that moment all existence began. Self-pleasure, a divine act of creation, pulsating with energy. With the onset of the dynastic period, an astonishing tradition emerged. The pharaoh had to, on the bank of the fertile Nile, reproduce the act of the god Atum. This was believed to be not only a guarantee of a good harvest in the coming year, but also a crucial ritual for maintaining balance between heaven and earth. Ordinary people, however, were warned against self-pleasure. Why? Because in that case, they would be dealing with a divine element beyond their control. Atum was considered a bisexual deity. His hand personified the feminine principle. And a simple mortal? He was a single-sex being, and such a fusion was considered dangerous. But sex was allowed for everyone. It was permeated by the cult of fertility. Sex was considered the foundation of the universe, a guarantee of immortality. It penetrated all spheres of Egyptian life. Symbols of fertility and phallic amulets were often placed next to the bodies of the deceased in tombs to ensure afterlife. Incredible, but true. Sex as a key to eternity. In Egyptian mythology, a deity deprived of a phallus was considered powerless, incapable of creation. The protector of the dead Osiris almost met such a fate. He was hacked into pieces by enemies, but his wife Isis and sons Horus and Anubis gathered him together, resurrecting him from the dead. Osiris's phallus drowned in the river, but Isis made a new one from Nile mud, and, as the myth says, breathed life into it. Therefore, in many images of Osiris, attention is focused precisely on this body part as a symbol of rebirth and fertility. That's the trick. How did a symbol acquire such power? Egyptians highly valued self-pleasure as a method of gratification, and not only among women. Cleopatra, queen of the Hellenistic period. She was famous for her ability to please lovers, many of whom she had. Despite not being the most attractive in appearance, she knew how to drive men wild with her intellect and sexual charisma. She seduced Caesar, bore him a son, was a step away from Rome falling at her feet like a submissive lion. But Caesar was killed by conspirators. According to legend, men were ready to give their lives for a night with Cleopatra. This underscores her legendary attractiveness. You'll never guess how she did it. Incest in Egypt was encouraged, but primarily among pharaohs, to preserve the purity of blood of the dynasty. Pharaohs married their sisters, nieces, and daughters to prevent the dilution of divine blood. Tutankhamun, the son of Akhenaten and his sister. This is a vivid example of the consequences of such a practice. Akhenaten, whose wife constantly bore daughters, desperately desiring a son, entered into a relationship with his own daughter. But she also bore a girl. Akhenaten's sister came to help. Tutankhamun was born from her, but he had weak health. He could not produce viable offspring and died quite early. This became a tragedy for the dynasty. The 18th dynasty, to which this pharaoh belonged, rapidly declined after his death. Sensation! Geneticists, after a series of examinations, found out incest killed the dynasty, leading to genetic defects. Shock. The price of pure blood turned out to be fatal. A keen interest in intimate life also influenced the Egyptians' lexicon and their culture. Their language had many synonyms for the female womb. This demonstrates the richness of this sphere. Yet, in poetry, they preferred metaphors and allegories for describing sexuality. In visual art, on the contrary, Egyptians were exceedingly explicit, not hesitating to depict erotic scenes. You will be amazed at how open their visual world was. Next, our journey takes us to India. This is not only a land of great contrasts and vibrant cultures, it is the homeland of the legendary Kama Sutra. But the Kama Sutra is not just an ancient Indian illustrated guide for producing new people. Oh no, it is a true treatise on love, encompassing all aspects of human relationships. The history of the Kama Sutra spans over 1,500 years. It reflects a deep philosophical tradition. Hindus believe the world was born from the fusion of god Shiva and goddess Shakti. This makes sex sacred, almost magical. Sex here is considered a path to God, a force of evolution, a manifestation of divine energy in the material world. One pose or another in the Kama Sutra is not just for enhancing sensual pleasure, but also for directing life energy. Wow, how much deeper can we perceive intimacy? The first thing that comes to mind when talking about India's sexual traditions. Of course, the Kama Sutra. But I'll let you in on a secret. Other treatises exist, less known but no less important. On the art of pleasure. There is the Koka Shastra. This treatise on passion, written in the 12th century, details various aspects of intimate relationships. It talks about types of kisses, diverse positions, and the sexual temperaments of partners and their compatibility. A total of about 120 treatises on love are known. Can you imagine? A whole library of pleasures. Together they form a detailed picture of India's sexual traditions. In India, there is even an indecent temple, the Khajuraho complex. It is entirely covered in bas-reliefs like living scrolls of passion. The inscriptions and sculptures in these temples speak of the science of pleasure, of how to properly give pleasure to a man and a woman. Shock! How explicitly can sexuality be expressed? For tourists from other countries, a sign should be placed at the entrance to this temple. No children allowed, due to the explicitness of the images. Temple prostitution, known as devadasis, was a social phenomenon in India until the early 20th century, approximately 90 years ago. It was considered a compromise between consensual sex and violence, which was condemned by society. To denote the concept of prostitute in Sanskrit, there are about 300 words. This speaks to the complexity and detailed nature of this institution. At the dawn of prostitution, girls dedicated to this profession were supposed to wear red clothing. Even gold they had to dye red. It was believed to ward off evil spirits and attract prosperity. By the way, devices designed to diversify sexual life are described in several sacred texts, mostly phallic in shape, but other types are also found, demonstrating the inventiveness of the ancient Indians. Wow, ancient masters of pleasure. Ancient Hindus recognized only caste-based sex, that is, hierarchical. India had 5 main castes: priests and scholars, warriors, merchants, servants, and untouchables, each with its own traditions. For most castes, marriage was considered a sacred institution. Therefore, adultery was severely punished, especially strictly, if it occurred between members of different varnas, between castes. In the Dharma Sutras, adulterous men were severely punished, and punishments were differentiated. Only a lover whose partner was from the same caste as him could get off with a fine. This was considered a lesser violation. If she was of lower origin, he was subjected to exile, imprisonment, or branding, and those men who had relations with a woman belonging to a higher caste were sentenced to death. This cannot be. How rigid were these social barriers? Concubinage and having a harem were not considered infidelity to the wife. This was part of acceptable social practices for men. That's the trick. Double standards in action. Ancient Hindus were not connoisseurs of same-sex love. They considered it unnatural. Although this type of sex was practiced from ancient times, this is mentioned in the sacred texts of the Puranas. Same-sex relations were attributed to demons. It was considered a manifestation of evil forces. Punishment for same-sex relations between men went as far as expulsion from caste. And this was one of the most severe punishments. It was believed that in the passive partner, the sexual act reversed the natural upward flow of sexual energy. The result? Mental and physical weakening of the body. This was a serious warning, yet active partners were not always considered homosexuals and were punished less severely. And lesbianism. It was also severely punished. Girls were fined 200 pan and given 10 lashes. Women caught in lesbianism had their heads shaved, 2 fingers cut off, and were paraded through the city on a donkey. For public shame. You will be shocked by the cruelty of these measures. Our steps lead us to ancient China, the land of dragons and delicate fabrics. There, the act of physical love was an important part of the natural order. It influenced many areas of life. It was the duty of both men and women not only to maintain the hereditary line. Sexual harmony was viewed as a way to strengthen health, achieve longevity, and maintain the balance of energies. The attitude towards lovemaking in China changed over time, from complete freedom of relationships in early history to quite strict frameworks in later periods. This heavily depended on the dominant religion and philosophical teachings. With the rise of Confucian ethics during the Qing dynasty, sex became a publicly taboo subject. Confucian followers actively suppressed sexual arts and the open expression of sensuality. Due to the taboo associated with sex, there was strong censorship during the Qing dynasty in art and literature. Wow, how philosophers managed to change the very essence of intimacy. However, from China during the era of Taoism, we inherited a rich erotic literature and erotic images. This was especially evident during the Tang dynasty, when Taoism reached its peak. In that era, Taoism was responsible for a new, more open and positive view of sexuality. Taoism promoted longevity and even immortality through breathing techniques, physical exercises, massages, and sexual practices. During the Han Dynasty, some Taoist sects considered the sexual act a spiritual act. It was called He Qi, union of energies. So-called sexual arts reached their apotheosis by the end of the Han Dynasty. They became part of cultural heritage. Taoists also considered sexual abstinence unnatural and harmful to health. They believed that celibacy, later propagated by Buddhists, was a source of neuroses and imbalance. However, Taoists agreed with Tantrism, a mystical branch of Buddhism which also promoted sexuality. Sexuality in Tantrism was viewed as an expression of enjoyment of life and as a means of psychological and physical health. Just imagine, sex as a path to immortality. But the most tumultuous, the most interesting sexual life occurred in the chambers of Chinese emperors. For harmony in the bed of the Son of Heaven, the emperor was considered a guarantee of happiness and the good state of life for his subjects. The emperor had a vast harem, wives and concubines. This was a symbol of his power, fertility, and connection with the cosmos. Moreover, the order of his coitus with these women was strictly regulated. Special officials monitored this to know exactly when a royal child could have been conceived. Each such coitus was recorded in special protocols and in chronicles. This was extremely important for the dynasty. However, not only men in the imperial family had their harems. It happened that princesses also possessed a large number of men, ready to please them at any moment, demonstrating female power. You will be amazed by the scale of these imperial beds. Regarding same-sex love, opposition to same-sex love began in China sometime during the medieval Tang dynasty. It strengthened in the second half of the Qing dynasty when Confucian norms became dominant. However, a negative attitude towards same-sex love in China did not always exist. Incredible, but true. There is more than enough evidence that same-sex relationships existed and were considered normal. These evidences are taken from ancient literature of the Ming dynasty. It spoke of same-sex relationships just as enticingly as heterosexual ones. I'll let you in on a secret. How views changed over centuries. Our journey concludes in ancient Rus, the land of forests, rivers, and ancient gods. The sexual life of ancient Slavs was associated with celebration, with merriment, with a natural manifestation of vital force. Strictly speaking, there were practically no strict prohibitions or taboos on intimate matters in the pre-Christian era. Why? Such an attitude toward sexuality was closely linked to the Slavs' perceptions of the surrounding world, of nature. Fire, water, sun, wind, trees, all elements, all objects, in the opinion of ancient people, possessed a soul and gender, like living entities, breathing and feeling. Consequently, nothing human was alien to them. And indeed, all living things, including sexual relationships. Slavs had a more than positive attitude toward sex. They saw in it something natural and even sacred. Both digamy, having two spouses, and polygamy occurred. This speaks to the flexibility of marital norms. Polygamy, by the way, is also mentioned in The Tale of Bygone Years, Nestor's Chronicle, which confirms its historicity. Wow, how freely our ancestors lived. And here's a curious ritual. It existed in many regions of ancient Rus during sowing, one of the most important moments of the year. Mother Earth, who bore grain, was compared to a woman. This directly influenced sowing customs. In some regions, men went out to plow without trousers, to stir up the earth, symbolically fertilizing it. The honesty of the bride, that is, her virginity before marriage, it was not considered a big burden or an obligatory requirement. During village festivals such as Kupala, virginity in marriage was often not even a consideration. This was part of the customs. The postulate of mandatory observance of bodily purity before marriage, the perception of sex as something dirty. This came to Rus with Christianity. I'll let you in on a secret. How much did morality change with the arrival of a new faith? With the arrival of Christianity on Russian soil in 988 and the strengthening of church power, the attitude towards sex began to change sharply. Cohabitation was allowed only for spouses. Those who had entered into a legal church marriage, sex in marriage, permitted exclusively for procreation, not for personal pleasure or carnal weakness. Sexual abstinence was mandatory during strictly regulated periods. These periods included church holidays, fasts, Sundays, Saturdays, and Fridays, which severely limited intimate life. Just imagine, with strict adherence to all these prohibitions, no more than 50 to 60 days a year remained for marital relations. To make it easier for husband and wife to observe abstinence, some spiritual figures recommended they sleep separately. But given the cramped living conditions of that time, this was difficult to execute, and considered a luxury, unless one of the spouses went to sleep in the hay in the hayloft, or in the field, which, by the way, happened in reality. However, it was precisely there, in secluded places, that couples usually secluded themselves, avoiding supervision and restrictions. Old people and children slept on the stove and sleeping platforms, which made personal life in the house practically impossible. Sex in marriage was now allowed only in one position, face to face. It was considered the most pious and least sinful. Any other positions, or sinful thoughts, strictly condemned and subject to confession. During confession, people were asked how and what are they doing, detailing their sexual practices. Prayer books have been preserved containing typical questions that a priest was supposed to ask parishioners about their intimate lives. Imagine this dialogue, where confession became almost an intimate interrogation. Standing sex was also forbidden, as an unnatural and sinful position deviating from the rules. Same-sex relations between men and unnatural intimacy, considered a great iniquity, for which severe punishments were threatened. Shock. How deeply the Church penetrated intimate life, and yet, relatively recently, an unmarried girl who entered into an intimate relationship was called a bludnica, and this, without a negative connotation. The word bludnica then meant she wandered and looked for a suitable husband, a normal practice. But in the 16th century, bludnica became a derogatory word. It acquired a sharply negative, condemnatory connotation. Virginity before marriage and marital fidelity within it became the main family virtues, especially for women. According to the Domistroi, an important 16th century collection of rules, all present at the wedding had to know: was the bride a virgin? This verification ritual was part of wedding ceremonies, symbolizing complete control over female honor. This cannot be. How sharply times changed. This odyssey through humanity's sexual histories. It reveals not only stunning differences, but also universal aspirations, connecting us with ancestors separated by millennia and continents. Understanding this multifaceted history helps us more deeply grasp our own prejudices and accept the complexity of human nature, its indomitable drive for intimacy, procreation, and pleasure. And most importantly, what from this past resonates within us today. May this journey inspire you towards a more open and honest dialogue about sexuality, recognizing its undeniable shaping role, both in the history of great civilizations and in each of us. Realize, intimacy is not only a basic biological need. It's a complex cultural artifact, like a multifaceted diamond, continuously shaping and reshaping civilizations throughout centuries. May knowledge of the past become a key to a more tolerant, understanding future, free from old dogmas, from binding prejudices, allowing us to build a world where acceptance and openness become the norm, not the exception. That's the trick. For history is a mirror in which we see ourselves. What did you see?